Hey, everybody, welcome to this special episode of the Tech Intersect podcast. We are knee deep in the Digital Money Demystified series. It's a special series of conversations where instead of hearing me extol the virtues of this amazing space, I'm inviting some of my rock star friends and colleagues and people whom I admire. Significantly in this space to come and have them take over my mic so that they can ask me questions and we collectively can help you demystify the space. And for this one in particular, we have a dear friend, Harold Hughes, who is coming to the show. He is no stranger to Tech Intersect, and we've had him here before. I'll drop a link to a previous conversation we have in the show notes. He's the founder and CEO of Bandwagon, which is a venture capital-backed identity infrastructure company that helps its customers transparently manage, aggregate, and store valuable customer identity data. I want you to come back and talk about that because identity is one of the most important uses and use cases that we actually can use this technology to improve. And the work
Yeah.
that you've done has been so tremendous in the space. And there's a lot of synergy in what we'll talk about today. But we
Yeah.
will talk about all of that and more in a moment. But first, fam,
First
Harold,
fam.
welcome.
It's so good to be here and I'm excited. And it's funny hearing that. I love that business and the business that we've been building, but that is the one that got disrupted by COVID. So here
Right.
we are sitting on the other side of 2020, and we had to pivot. And I think that's some of the conversations you and I have talked about. And so as we sit today, Bandwagon cares a lot about the experience and the identity information, but we understand that today it's really, really hard to pinpoint that. Users are
Mm,
really concerned, or fans are very careful about how they share information. And so we've been really excited about building in this experience space and understanding how we can create opportunities for you and I and other people who may
mhm.
share a certain affinity group in common, but have a lot of different differences. How do you bring those people together? And so as an experienced technology company headquartered in Greenville, South Carolina, we've been excited to be building on the blockchain since about 2016. And so we've been able to see some of the ebbs and flows. We saw the ICO wave. We saw the NFT madness. And so being able to be here and stay through all of it has been really tremendous. And I'm thankful for that opportunity.
Absolutely, because you're, when I think of when I began in 2017, you were one of the first people who I knew. I consider you an OG in the space and really a
Yeah.
stalwart in terms of like leading the charge. And you kind of like
Thank you.
we're sojournering and Harriet Tubmaning,
Yeah.
there's like all of us aren't going to make it, but those who do, this can be transformative. And so that's why I love to just walk out and kind of riff off of this with you for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's exactly it. I often talk about to understand anything, it takes two people, really. It takes one person who is curious and has the courage to ask and say, hey, I don't know this. Can someone help me? Or I want to learn more about this. Where do I go for resources? So it takes one person who's curious and courageous. And on the other side, it takes an expert who's going to take their time and be patient
Mm,
and have empathy and try and think through examples. And so as an expert, you're thinking about, okay, what did I have to do to get to the point where I know what I know? And the person who's asking, where can I start telling them insight from their lens? It's oftentimes as an expert, you like to say, oh, you should just do this, and it's just going to light bulb go off. But sometimes we have to really be intentional about, man, this is a little bit meatier to understand. And sometimes there's some misinformation out there, as you noted in your
mm,
book. And so
mm.
it's important to make sure that we have both those parties, that expert who's willing to take time and be patient, as well as a curious person who's willing to put themselves out there. So I'm excited about the conversation.
Outstanding. Well, I put this microphone in your very capable hands, sir. How can we help? Let's help them. I'm going to help you help them. And
Right, right,
together we're going
right.
to help each other because of what you said about the patient educator with the intellectually curious person is like magic. But of course,
Yeah.
as an educator, you speak in my language, so I love it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's where you can jump in. I mean, I know that as a dad of two kids, one of the things I think about is what does the world look like for that generation? And,
Mm,
when we were growing up, everyone was taking typing classes. Remember that when we had to take typing
Absolutely.
classes? And that was coming on the heels of us having to write in cursive. And so there's a lot
Mhm.
of things that we expected were going to be valuable tools and valuable skills that may not be as necessary today. And so now, as we live in a world of AI and blockchain, understanding what's going to matter in 10, 15, 20 years is something that I'm constantly thinking about. And I think that the one thing that will always be valuable is being able to comprehend and being able to explain. It's a soft skill that is something that I think that you do really well, is being able to take a complex subject and break it down. It's also one of my superpowers too, is to be able
Mhm.
to take a complex topic and break it down simply for everyone. And so that's something that's going to be interesting as we look at the blockchain specifically. There's a lot of folks who get kind of scared. And I think part of that is built by design. If I'm being honest, I think
Mm.
that there are some people who intentionally make things feel more techy or more challenging so that they can gatekeep it. And that's
Mm.
why it's important for the work that we're doing and this conversation that we're having.
That's a really good point because, on one hand, when I think of just the origins of digital currency, that, there were digital currencies that even predate Bitcoin, of course.
Yeah, of course.
It makes me think of like DigiCash and things like that. But
Right.
um, this novel combination of consensus mechanisms, or the way
Hmm.
that you come to an agreement
Right.
about what is true for a group of folks, right? And peer-to-peer technology that was used for now this is a video portion, so some of you will be able to see me do this in air quotes, file sharing.
Right.
As an intellectual
Right.
property lawyer, it's kind of like theft, it's fine.
Right.
But the idea of using peer-to-peer software and file sharing applications in order to exchange media files can now be used in combination also with cryptography, or this
Hmm.
encrypted means of messaging. It's as simple as that. But
Yeah.
putting them all together and access to the internet in order to transfer value in the same
Yeah.
way that we were transferring media and messaging is really, really important. And I guess there's a certain level of basic knowledge that's important to have when buying cryptocurrencies, but you don't need to know how to code. You don't
Right.
even
Right.
have to have a strong background in finance. But to your point, when you have tech jargon and you have financial jargon and you put them
Yeah.
together and they like have a baby and we call it crypto, that could be
Yeah.
really intimidating for folks. And some of that, as you say, is a feature and not a bug, of kind
Exactly.
of having it on one hand saying we have this technology, it's accessible to all, but
Right.
only if you're in the club that even understands what we're talking about.
And can cross certain hurdles when you think about the financial access. I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking through more as a person who, I'm a Jamaican American. I was, raised in Jamaican culture in Columbia, South Carolina, but am definitely proudly an American citizen. There's a extra or an othering that happens with crypto in the United States specifically because we have the financial system that we have. And
Right.
so when you hear the lens of how people talk about crypto, specifically cryptocurrency, I try not to say crypto because to me, crypto means cryptography and it becomes a whole
Agreed.
thing. But when it comes to cryptocurrencies and the ways it's discussed in the United States specifically, there's an othering that happens, and it's used for nefarious behavior and all these other things. And you've talked about that as well. And the
Hmm.
idea here is that there are a lot of countries where this actually creates a very, very useful mechanism for the citizens and allows businesses to transact in a safer way. And,
Hmm.
as we walk through the community that we're in these days, how many stores and restaurants and businesses have you seen that are cashless?
Right.
Literally saying for the safety of our employees, we have no cash in this building. Please do not come in here looking for cash. Now imagine what that does when you talk about cryptocurrencies and the various economies around the rest of the world. So I do think all of that matters for sure.
Yeah, and when we think about the educational and technical foundation that is necessary, I guess, to fully understand and appreciate how cryptocurrencies. I agree with you about crypto. You have a technology background,
Yeah.
um, but
Radio Shack taught me.
no doubt, right?
Right.
And I even talk more generally about crypto assets. Like, I think it's a bit of
Yeah.
a misnomer to always say currency
Oh, for
when
sure.
there's so many other uses. And I think people get boxed into their current understanding of currency
Yeah.
and try and fit all of these programmable options and opportunities to transact value as currency. It could also be store of value. There are all sorts of other use cases I'd love to unpack with you, because with your experience background, you bring so much more in terms of a point of view that extends beyond finance, right?
Right.
The underlying technology for sure, but even just the way of digitizing certain types of assets that make
Yes.
things better, faster, more seamless, more available. And that's why I feel like if we can push past the myth that it's too complicated, so let's not even try, to start to
Yeah.
show people that there are a range of options that include currencies that
Right.
really make this important to learn sooner than later.
Yeah, and I think that that's important. I think that oftentimes with so many other technologies and technical revolutions, we don't really care as much about the how. But for
Mm.
some reason, crypto and cryptocurrencies have been stuck in a how in a very big and public media cycle. I don't understand how Bluetooth works, but I understand that if I'm playing audio from my phone to my headphones, it works great. There may be a slight delay as I go farther away, and then at some point it disconnects completely. So I understand
Mm.
some basic understanding of the distance that's required. I don't completely understand the cloud in its like technical nature, but we all
Mm.
understand like, oh, I can save a picture here and it's accessible and viewable in multiple places. And so we've been able to overcome the challenges of a lot of things: keyless start, Bluetooth headphones, the access to the cloud. But for some reason, when it comes to cryptocurrencies and unlocking the value of the blockchain, you still have people saying, well, I don't know about keeping my private keys, and I don't know how to safely manage this. And so it's really interesting. And I hope that, through resources that you're creating, resources that I'm creating, things that we're seeing, conversations that we're having, we'll see people be more comfortable putting their toe in and trying a little bit. And that's really it, is that we're not saying that anyone should put their house on it. We're saying that you should be aware of how this technology works, because in some cases that cycle could pass you by, and we don't want to have that.
Absolutely, especially because we see how quickly technology is just at an accelerated pitch, even for us. When you
Yeah, for sure.
think of the time to, that used changes like this used to take hundreds of years or
Right.
decades or years. Now we're dealing in months.
Yeah.
It's like, don't get, no grass is growing under technology at this point, because it's
Yes.
moving at a greater clip. I don't know if it's some part of me getting older, but it could be a both and. I think this is the both and of things really accelerating in ways that don't give us the I don't know, the privilege of
Mhm.
sitting back and waiting until someone else tells us or gives us permission to learn about something that could be so transformative. And it makes me think of those really early years when you think about acquiring a lot of real estate, for example.
Mhm.
Real
Mhm.
estate's always going to be a great investment. I own real estate. I
Yeah.
get it. But it would have been better for me to buy a lot of stuff 20 years ago
Yeah,
than
for
it
sure.
is today, to be
Right.
sure. And I think about the dot-com boom,
Yeah.
slight bust reorganization into the dramatic centralization of power that we're experiencing now. Though that whole thing in Silicon Valley really happened before most of us knew what was going on. We just didn't have the connections, the know how, the resources to really understand. And so many of
Yeah.
the things that are of concern for people about cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, if they can figure that out, remind
Right.
me a lot of those old conversations about the interweb. And it
Yeah.
makes me think of like Katie Couric and
Oh yeah.
Brian
That was
Gumbel talk,
the
right?
email.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The email, right? And we're
Yeah.
going to call in some like young folks to figure out where this is and where it comes from. Like, we don't need to know all that.
Right.
To your point, I don't know how my super awesome car works for
Right.
sure,
Right.
but
Right.
I know it gets me from one place to another. So this
Yeah.
idea again that things are too complicated or challenging, we can push past it when we have an overriding need or interest, I suppose, and maybe that's where education comes in.
Well, I definitely think that's where it starts for sure. But the other piece I think we should emphasize is it's important to make sure we're diversifying the users, because they're
Mm.
going to diversify the use cases. An example I came up with recently is if you take, 10 of the smartest engineers you can find and put them in a room and hand them a wrench and say, tell me everything you can possibly use this wrench for, you're going to get a pretty substantial list. And then if you have those 10 engineers leave, and then you bring in a librarian, a pastry chef, you bring in a botanist, and you bring in all these different people and say, hey, tell me everything you think you can do with this device, this tool. You're going to get additions to that engineers list. And so when you think about the how homogenous some of these user bases are when it comes to the technology today, I think that actually does a disservice to our ability to accelerate its adoption, because we're still thinking about it in the lens of who the current users are instead
Mm-hmm.
of thinking about who could use it in the future. And so it's important to not only be intentional about diversifying the users, but also being intentional about diversifying the use cases. And that really comes from giving people a comfortability to say, okay, let's try something different. What do you think we can do with this? And so I think that that is, removing the complexities of it and just explaining the bare bones, and then giving people the tools to be able to say, oh, we'll play with this and tell me what you come up with. I think that that is incredibly powerful.
And it's often when people find that spark of interest in, some area that either they have existing expertise. That's how
Right.
I came into the space. Like, I don't know about this magic internet money, but
Right. Right.
this
Right.
open source software is interesting to an intellectual property lawyer getting questions
Exactly.
about how to build decentralized applications on top of, open source software, what that means as a matter of monetization. Like, that was my entry point. And as I started to uncover certain things and aligning those with things I already understood, that led
Hmm.
to a host of other questions that naturally created this, not just the vortex or the like the rabbit hole experience, really.
Yeah.
That is so deeply personal and subjective because it depends on your entry point. But it
Right.
was that curiosity of what it meant for education, what this meant for the law, what this meant for copyright in my case, really propelled me to get curious and then ask the questions that led to the next questions in this
Yeah.
constant evolution of education in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really it. Is and that goes back to curiosity and being courageous about it. Is asking that next question, and then that question leads to another question. And so it's been really exciting for me to even participate in this from the beginning of our own story. We
Mm,
were using blockchain initially in the zero knowledge proof space, and we're thinking about cryptography and thinking about identity information. And then now you're seeing all of these different types of assets, whether it's cryptocurrencies, whether you're talking about digital art, whether you're talking about provenance of certain collectibles. And so
mm,
that's where I think the biggest thing is that there are so many archaic structures that exist today that can be improved if you use the technology. But some of those agencies, some of those departments may be intentionally trying to slow down the adoption, because it may show how inefficient we are. It may lead to us changing not necessarily who is employed, like the number, but who is employed in what areas and what ways. And we can repurpose and reallocate those human beings who are really skilled and talented and have expertise and put them in other places to continue to provide for the community, to continue to provide for the private and public markets. And I think that that's where you can get the opportunity to unlock, but we've got to take the chance of saying, how could we improve this and be more efficient?
yes, that definitely leads to this idea of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which is
Right.
reduced to an acronym in this ecosystem for FUD. I'm sure you could use it in others as well, but
Right. Right.
it's common here. This idea of intentionally injecting disinformation um, for hype cycles or negative hype cycles around
For sure.
cryptocurrencies. And that can certainly make it difficult to separate credible sources of information from unreliable ones,
Right.
particularly when that information is coming from government or
Right.
coming from um, industries that have a
Yeah.
vested interest in
Yeah.
keeping people beholden to them and not worrying their pretty little heads about sovereignty and financial
Yeah.
privacy and the type of self determination that comes from financial literacy and freedom, right? There's
Right.
so many, um, the word bad actor is coming to me, but that sounds like criminal. That's
Yeah.
a story for another day. But those
Right.
who
Right.
are intentionally injecting misinformation and spreading false information, and these are coming from what would, by outward appearances, appear to be legitimate news sources. Like
Right.
some of those headlines just drive me over the
Bombastic.
edge. It's
Yeah.
just like, are we kidding here? And it's like, is it
Yeah.
lazy or intentional or intentionally lazy? Like it's all too much. And that
Oh,
is
for sure.
confusing for newcomers, to be sure.
Well, when I think about it, one of the things I often talk about is that we need to treat knowledge more like a library and less like a vault. So the idea is
Mm,
that knowledge should be shareable. It should be freely accessible, and that it should be continuing to grow. We don't want libraries to stay the same size. We want libraries to get bigger. But ultimately, when it comes to whether it's cryptocurrencies or cryptography or
mhm,
blockchain or even access to wealth in other ways, when we talk about all the
mhm,
other assets, there has been an intentional nature of there's a finite amount of this, and therefore I don't want to let you know what I know because that means
right,
I have less or I will be less prosperous. And so
right.
that's where the challenge of information is. And so it's important for the knowledge sharing to continue. Of course, you have to be skeptical. I think skepticism is important, especially in an area where we are very clearly able to see there are some people who are out for personal gain and they
Right.
are willing to share misinformation to do so. And so just waiting just an extra click or reading just another page or asking just another person their thoughts on something, I think really helps change how we consume some of the information. It changes some of the actions and activities we deem as like, this seems like a good idea. And so
Mm,
those types of things I think help. And so when you talk about something being too complicated or too complex, this isn't hidden anywhere, and that's one of the beauties of the blockchain is how transparent a lot of it is. And so
mm,
being able to understand that, oh, you may have to read an extra disclosure or you may need to tap another person to let them know you're considering it. That's something I think is actually driving community connection. We don't
mm.
want people working on this on their own. We want you in community with people and saying, hey, have you read about this or have you learned about this protocol or have you seen this asset? And I think that that gives you the opportunity to have more knowledge shared faster and safer.
That's a really interesting point that I'd not fully fleshed out before because part of what accelerated my learning curve in the space was connecting with people and asking
Yeah.
questions and having the space to do so. There's
Hmm.
something happening in the space now where it feels less, in some spaces, less collaborative, somewhat
Yes.
judgmental, somewhat tribal. People would
Yeah.
describe it. If you're rocking for one particular one or the other, and I'm not
Yep.
mentioning any because
Right.
don't at me, bro. We're just having a conversation. But the idea of being in community for a greater purpose is really part of the ethos and the spirit when we think of like the cypherpunk days or
Yes.
even, do you remember when I wrote this article? It was a Medium article. I feel like I reached out to you about it,
Mhm.
but it was mapping the ethos and kind of spirit of cypherpunks with Kwanzaa principles.
Oh
And it was
wow. No,
like a
I missed that
really
one.
right. Well, I'll drop that in the show notes as well. It was
Yeah,
a
drop that
really
in the show
interesting.
notes.
It was fire because I was like, you know what? There's another group of folks that doesn't really trust the government, needs community, needs self determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, and I was like, that's like super cyberpunk,
Well,
and this is interesting.
and can I say this? And I think it's really important to note, like, there's been all these different studies about how specifically the black community will own more
Mm,
crypto than our non-black peers based on whatever statistic or characters you're identifying. But it's
mm,
been so underreported about, well, why could that be?
right,
Why would people who look like me and you not love the banking system? Could it be predatory interest rates? Could it be redlining in certain areas where you could or could not get a mortgage? Is
right,
it the various settlements we're seeing from some of the largest banks in the country that talked about overdraft fees and
right.
all of these different other things? And so I think that, while all of these things play an important part in our overall financial system, you touched on it earlier when we talk about sovereignty, there is a
Mm,
necessity that we need to start to consider is that how much of this can we control? How much of this can we play a part in? And in no way am I endorsing saying like, oh, pull everything out of the banks. I was
right.
just talking to a guy that I met at a crypto conference, and we went and grabbed coffee, a couple of days ago, and he told me that he is trying to unplug from the system. He transfers from his crypto to his, USDC or whatever bank account he
Yep.
uses, $5,000 a month in fiat. And so up until 90% of what he owns is held in some digital asset, and he transfers the money every month and has to do
Mm.
the thing. And I'm thinking, like, man, the average person doesn't have the time for that. And we could have a whole
No.
nother conversation about like rest and how many people in the United States don't actually have that as a luxury. But
Mm.
being able to have the opportunity to do those things is huge. And so I think about that is like a more extreme version than simply saying, we just want you to be aware of this. We want you to
Right.
consider this as an additional resource and tool to use on your financial journey as you think about your sovereignty and your freedom, as well as your goals that you may have personally.
This is the point that I want to leave folks with,
Yeah.
that we have to push past. There's so many other things, and you raise them about redlining and systemic marginalization, Black and
Mhm.
Brown communities, women, queer community. There's
Yep.
so many folks who are on the outside looking in, also a feature, not a bug. Some parts of
Indeed.
some parts of the book. In fact, I added an entire chapter. Thank you, Lynette Calfani Cox, who is one of the forward authors for my book, that says, I really, she pushed me. She said, I think you need to do a deeper dive here. And
Yeah.
that led me back to like the Ariel Schwab Investors Survey for Black investors that had all of these things, all of these data points that showed
Yeah.
over indexing for Black investors, but
Right.
without the why, the question
It,
why,
it's so wild.
right?
It was right there. It's like they went all the way up to the line and said, these people are
Yeah, they're just
not
crazy.
sophisticated investors. And it's just like,
Right,
okay. So yeah,
right.
that's troubling and challenging. And so I think that that's important to make sure we're looking at this saying, hey, we're going to speak truth to power. It's important to leverage not only, you think about social capital. I was talking to my cousin last week.
Mm,
As a Caribbean, as a Jamaican, you have the padna. In some cultures, they call it a susu and all this, basically group economics and thinking about a new financial system and tool.
yes,
And it's just like that. And those types of products and tools and work on social capital and trust.
that's
And
right.
so my grandmother would run this, and everyone would be in for however much. And my grandmother knew who she could trust to deliver on on their part. And everyone was able to lean on my grandmother. Said, "Well, if you know her, then we trust you."
Right.
And so that's kind of how I think it is as we look at educators in the space. Specifically yourself. I'm just kind of a hobbyist here as we're explaining this stuff, but it's important for us to not only be really, really sharp and intentional about the information, but to be mindful of how valuable our social capital is, because it is what's considered when people say, should I read this
Hmm.
information? Who wrote this? What did they
Right.
do? How are they supporting our community? How are they leaning in to educate others? I think that's the kind of thing we think through and need to be, as intentional about as anything else when it talks about consuming content.
It's a perfect way to put an exclamation point at the end of this. And I feel like this is an altar call now. So is there one who will come?
Yeah,
Listen, it's about the only barrier at this point is our willingness to have a fundamental mind shift that considers the possibility that the future is being written now. We're building the plane while we're flying it. And
right.
this idea of a first mover advantage, even just as a matter of education,
Yeah,
with informed and trusted resources and vetting them. It's like when I find information, I want two other trusted resources and probably a conversation to say
right.
it's more likely than not.
Yeah,
But as we said earlier, look, I never learned the inner workings of my supercomputer on wheels, known as
right,
my car, but I
right,
do know why it exists. I do know how to operate it for its intended purpose to get me from point A to point B. I don't know the inner workings of the ATM, but I know enough to be able to get money out of my account,
right.
also in air quotes. And I'm still learning things
Hmm.
about this space and also about my TV. But the
Right.
point is that you don't have to know all the things about all the things in order to lean into resources. Certainly at digitalmoneydemystified.com. Certainly in the book, there are free masterclasses. There are more in depth opportunities for coaching and community, which is an
Yeah.
important takeaway from here, and content. And you can learn the fundamentals and complete your first transaction faster than you think. And it
Yeah.
really, final point for me is I could pontificate, I could intellectualize, I could consider it an academic exercise until I had to set up my first wallet,
Yeah.
which, it was minutes. And then once I had it, it was like, okay, don't exactly know how to do it, but I have this. We have done a lot of the heavy lifting, so you don't have to. It's way
Hmm.
better from a user interface and user experience point of view today in
Oh, for sure.
2023, and it'll be light years ahead of 2024, 2025, and beyond than when you got in back in
Right. Oh, yeah.
2015, 2016, and certainly
Yeah.
for me, 2017. So we say all that to say this is an important moment for empowerment, and that is going to come through get yourself some knowledge and then turn that knowledge into wisdom, and so
Yeah.
that we stay ready so that we don't have to get ready, because this is the opportunity where people and systems aren't keeping us out. It's maybe thinking that our ignorance will save us, and it actually won't. We'll be
Yeah.
further behind than we've ever been with the exponential leap of technology. So, Harold, final points from you, sir?
Yeah, no, I think that that was perfect. So much of this uncertainty, fear, doubt comes from like not feeling comfortable, and based on, like we said, some of the information is presented in a way to make us feel like it's really scary. You say, "Oh, you've got to memorize your private keys and keep them
Right.
safe." It's like, well, you don't have to memorize your private keys. You can keep them safe in the same way you don't walk around with your social security card. In the
Right.
same way, you don't publicly share your bank PIN. And then when you think about, well, oh, well, there's a crypto address, and I'm going to send, Tonya, some Ethereum or some Bitcoin. What's your address? It's like, well, if I was sending her an email, I'd ask for her email address. If I was
Right.
mailing her a postcard, I'd ask for her home address. It's just where you put the field in. If I'm wiring money, I ask what your account information is and your routing. So those things are actually more common and more similar than a lot of the times it's connected. And so
Mm,
ultimately the thing I loved about the book was being able to say we're drawing parallels here, and
mm,
and you aren't starting from zero. I think that's the number one thing I'd leave with, is that you aren't starting from zero. There are a lot of things in your life, and as you covered in the book, that you can actually start with and say, do you understand this? Well, this is more like this. And it's not
mm,
as complicated as you think it is. It's just that the lens that you've likely heard it from may not be intentionally trying to connect dots for you to jump in at a point of comfortability as well as understanding. And so I'm excited about it coming out. And I'm glad we've been able to have this conversation. For me, it's really about creating that community and sharing information, and thinking about collaboration over competition. We can do more together, and being able to partner and build this community that we want to.
outstanding. Harold Hughes from Bandwagon, and my friend, not only in my head and on the platform formerly known as
Interwebs.
X, but
Yeah, all right.
right, right, in real life from a first fam perspective. I appreciate you, sir. And
Thank you. Thank you.
onward. Let's keep making it happen.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Thank you, and can't wait to see it come out.